Hey guys, so if you didn't know, I am a huge Interstellar fan. You know, the movie Interstellar, one of my favorite movies of all time. And I feel like the writing in that is so great. And I want to break down some of the writing in that. I mean, I already have. And talk about like different writing lessons from it. So whether or not you've seen it, that's fine because these writing lessons can help you whichever way. But if you have seen it, you'll know a little bit more about, you'll see how what I'm trying to say is you'll see some of the cool things that they did in that movie. So this first video, I want to talk about how they flipped a lot of cool story stuff, and we can do the same thing in our stories. The first thing is they kind of like inverted concepts. So Christopher and Jonathan Nolan, they're the ones who wrote Interstellar, right? They flipped the concept of a robot on its head. And they did this so much that Christopher didn't even like thinking of them as robots. He calls them machines. So to some, right, do you guys remember those robots, the big rectangle ones, right? There's Tars and there's Case. There's also Kip, but he blows up. Anyway, to some, Tars and Case might just kind of seem like these weird, they're just these huge rectangle things, right? But other viewers loved them. And here is the brilliance of Tars and Case. They are the exact inverse of our concept of a robot. So let me explain. So in the behind the scenes clip on them, because of course, I watched all of that stuff after I watched the movie, Christopher Nolan talks about how robots, they usually try to look human, or at least some specific, or a specific creature or object. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted to make Tars and Case to just look like a thing, quote, look like a thing. And as I watched the movie, I remembered how most humor comes from robots, comes from them being too literal. They take things too literal. And they usually lack a humanness about them. Often they don't understand human emotion, and that's where the writers get the humor out of these robots. But if you watch this movie, you'll notice that the Nolans didn't do that. They wanted to create Tars and Case to have humanness on the inside of them. And they wanted it to come across like Cooper and these guys were buddies. So we get Cooper saying things like, "See ya on the other side, Slick." And that nickname kind of gives us the sense that these are pals. Christopher wanted Tars and Case to sound and feel human when talking. So for once, we actually got robots that understood human emotion and had real humor, even to the point of making jokes off the fact they were robots. So the Nolans turned this concept of a robot literally inside out. So a typical robot character looks human on the outside, but it struggles to understand human behaviors, thought processes, and emotions on the inside. But they flipped that opposite. So Tars and Case, they look super inhuman on the outside. They just look like a thing, right? Look like a thing, quote. But they appear, they're quite human on the inside. So they're the inverse of a typical robot character. We still get the feeling of Tars and Case kind of being other because of how inhuman they look. And Christopher talks about how he, yes, wanted them to connect in human ways, but to visually look apart from humans. So they almost fit in with other humans, but they can never quite fully fit in. Okay, the next thing is they mixed genres. And I think we can do that in our own stories a little bit. And this really comes from the music. So in the past, I've talked about, at least on my blog, how you can kind of make a story feel new by borrowing things from other genres and putting it in. So Brandon Sanderson, he crossed epic fantasy with heist stories to create Mistborn, his novel or series. And so Interstellar, it mixed science fiction with music that's typically associated with spirituality and religion. And when considering the music for that movie, Christopher said he didn't want the composer Hans Zimmer to know the genre of the movie. He didn't want it to sound all sci-fi. He didn't want it to sound electric and futuristic. So he actually didn't tell Hans a thing about the movie. All he did was give Hans a few lines of dialogue between Cooper and Murph and asked him to compose for the day and see what he came up with. So he came up with the main theme and worked off that, even after he knew it was a science fiction space story. All through the behind the scenes stuff, Christopher was talking about how he wanted the movie to feel very human, so he and Hans tried to bring that in the music. Everything was very focused on feeling and sounding very real, not electronic, not inhuman. So in particular, they brought the organ into it, right? If you remember, that's a kind of prominent part of the music. and they talked about how the organ had been used in movie scores, but like really only for horror or like wedding scenes. And they talked about how the organ is heavily associated with religion and spirituality, two things that are often absent in science fiction films. Interstellar, it isn't religious, but Christopher wanted to have a spiritual feel about it. So they worked with and played up the organ. They took what was usually used in religion and crossed it with science fiction, and did with an organ what we haven't heard in no other movie score. And frankly, like no organ, we never hear them do those kinds of songs usually. So it felt fresh and it felt original because it was original and it was cool. And, they were going for this whole human thing. And so they also liked the organ because it sounded very human and real because it's air through pipes, right? And that's how we speak. And so there's places in the score where you get this sound like it's like a huge exhalation. And it sounds really cool. So the sci-fi genre, to me, when it comes to movies, usually capitalizes on like very futuristic and otherworldly aspects and sounds. But Christopher and Hans meshed it with the exact opposite, which is human sounds, and it was awesome. Obviously, if you're a writer, your story like probably doesn't have its own music score, right? But you can still take this lesson in. The principle remains the same. To make your story fresh or different, or possibly even more powerful, look at borrowing aspects of other genres. Now, you have to be kind of careful because like you don't want to mix your story in such a way that it doesn't really fit any genre. You just want to borrow a few things. At least you need to be careful of that if you actually want to like sell your story to like on the market. If you're just writing like entirely for yourself, you can do what you want. If you're going to sell it, you want to make sure you don't change it too much because you got to still appeal to the right audience. But anyway, so you can look at that for your stories. Another great thing done, they broke expectations when they dealt with science fiction and the apocalypse. And this is something that can be so important when writing. So one of the first things Christopher Nolan said when he started working on Interstellar was that he didn't want to focus on creating a futuristic world, which is kind of ironic, right? Considering it's a science fiction story set in the future, which usually like we've all seen movies that are set that way. They have flying cars and big cities. But instead, he picked a very kind of hometown feel. By breaking this kind of rule, if you can call it a rule, he made Interstellar like more relatable to us and more human. And the story wasn't something that felt far away, it felt close. Again, it makes the movie feel like more human and less otherworldly, which still seems kind of ironic because one of the primary draws of futuristic stories is that they take us to a world, usually more advanced than ours. So we get that escapism paired with that sense of wonder. But he did something different, right? And he did a similar thing with how he handled the apocalypse, okay? He didn't create this horrific, nightmarish world of catastrophe that we usually see in Hollywood. Instead, he wanted to create an Earth that was still beautiful, one that people would love to live on. He did this so it would seem like more difficult to leave Earth because it's a beautiful home and it's sad to have to leave it, as opposed to like on an apocalyptic world that people want to escape. So he broke that common perception of an apocalypse. So breaking up preconceived notions can be a great way to kind of flip a story. But again, it takes some wisdom and some talent, because if you break them by giving the audience something less than they expect, they might be disappointed. So it's okay to break expectations if you're doing it right and for the right reasons, and it's all about having control over that. So for the Nolans, they decided that their story gained more power by making it a tragedy to leave Earth, rather than focusing on the horror of living on it. They also opted for relatability rather than wonder. There are some like crazy killer reasons for why doing both of these things actually made the story way more powerful, which I'm going to talk on in the future. But I will say that having that space provided the horror and real wonder, like going to outer space, it really is what provided the horror and the wonder for the movie. And so, it makes sense why Earth didn't have that contrast. Okay, so they also pushed beyond boundaries. Honestly, it wasn't like I thought the very choice of how they approached the like apocalyptic disaster was so refreshing, because like I swear almost every post-Earth movie that has come out in the last 10 years has had to do either with global warming or how humans have destroyed the environment and have depleted Earth, or both. And like I totally get why those have been the focus lately, but like it's so cliche. Like I just want to scratch out my ears every time a story talks about that. In fact, I heard that just the other week and I was like, "Oh my gosh, can we not think of anything new?" But seriously, like can they not like find any other ways, other reasons that humans have to leave Earth? Like, I mean, but given if you use a cliche, you don't have to explain it very much because everyone's so familiar with it, so you can kind of move on. But the Nolans, they gave us this like beautiful break from like the sermon that we've been getting, and I'm like, hallelujah! Like the method of the apocalypse, like it wasn't some crazy storm or tornadoes or heat or an asteroid. Like it was the blight and it was the dust. And the Dust Bowl was like a real disaster in the 1930s. Like why the heck hasn't anyone like ever used that as a method of an apocalypse before? Like it was so refreshing. And the Nolans, like they had to and all the Nolans had to do to get there was like they had to push beyond these cliches and press through all the redundant stuff that clutters the forefront of our minds and do some research and find something that hadn't been done in the last few decades. So as writers, cliches are always the first things that come to our mind because I mean, like, of course they are, because we've heard them so many times. And the moment we realize we need, like, a reason for humans having to leave Earth, we automatically think, oh, Earth is being ruined because of humans. And then we think about the same cliche in, like, 5 different ways because we've seen it done, like, 5 million different times. And, like, but we need to try to push beyond the first half dozen ideas that we think of because they've all been done before. So you need to stretch your brainstorming to find something fresh. Okay, this one they did really well. They crossed opposites a lot, like through the entire movie. I'm going to talk about this more in the future in more depth because this is such a powerful storytelling tool that I feel like everybody who writes should know about. And I've talked about this previously, right, about pairing opposites, like whether it's your character and his like best friend being foil somewhere or just other things foiling, but like it is so dang effective, and writers just should take advantage of that on a small scale and a large scale. So pairing opposites, it gives us complexity, breeds originality, and makes the story more powerful. So here's just a small scale example of how pairing opposites can be effective. So for the farm in Interstellar, Christopher looked at some places in Canada where they could build it. And he wanted to get the scenery just right. So he found like this beautiful piece of land up north and then he planted corn on it. So to the average person that doesn't seem like a big deal, but here's the thing. Corn doesn't grow in places like that. Like it doesn't. The scenery and the crop, like they're opposites. They don't belong together, and he smashed them together, and he had to work like quite a bit on trying to get the corn to actually grow there. So visually, it gives us something new. I mean, I think we've all seen like cornfields in movies, but we hadn't seen it in that exact same type of setting. We haven't seen a farm quite like this before. So it's like a cool micro concept, right? But it tells us a lot. Cooper's trying to grow corn in a place that doesn't let corn grow. It gives us that subtle, almost like subliminal feeling that like this world is dying. But then here's the thing, Interstellar also paired opposites on like the large scale in the storyline itself. Like we have like the grandeur of space crossed with like this small town, small farm town life. And like seriously, like can you get any bigger or more vast and more unknowable than space? And can you get a place like any much more intimate and personal than a farm out in the north by itself? Like probably not. And then we have the focus of the story, right? We have the survival of the whole human race, and it crosses with this single human relationship between father and daughter. One of the biggest things, one of the most intimate things. And throughout the entire movie, the vast and the grand is paired with the intimate and the personal, until at the climax they like literally cross paths. They intercept over time and space. And the most grand and unknowable place in space is basically almost literally the same as the most personal and intimate place in the world. And that a person can have, like a bedroom, right? So the fact is that very breadth, it's that width that pairing opposites creates that makes us feel stronger, sharper, more potent emotions. And it sounds like it should be the opposite, right? That we should focus on one thing because we think that the more we focus on it, the more of there is of it, so the more powerful it is. But that's not how it works with writing. The Nolans said they wanted Interstellar to like really evoke a strong sense of wonder about space, to make like the audience curious and captivated by space. And like a younger writer who would probably approach this goal by trying to like spend more and more time in space and capturing the beauty and like the mysticism and like everything about space, they may focus like the whole script on that. But a clever writer will recognize that they actually need to pair it with the opposite. In addition to wanting the movie to like evoke wonder over the heavens, they'll want it to feel personal and intimate. They'll want it to feel human, right? The bigger the contrast, the more powerful and sharper the story hits us. And that's the foil, right? Taking the audience from one end of the spectrum to the other makes it emotionally sharp. The further we travel between extremes, the deeper we'll be touched. And like I have so many other things other tips and writing lessons that I've learned from the Nolans that I do want to cover. But just remember these things, right? These tricks to take your story to the next level. You can invert concepts, mix genres, break expectations, push beyond cliches, and cross opposites. Thanks for joining me today. You can subscribe. That'd be awesome if you did. And you can get my latest writing tips at septembercfox.com. Thanks, and see you next time.